Near the close of the 1800s, America had a huge problem, an ailment that had been persistently weighing on the public health for decades, and it was only getting worse. Everyone was eating poison. And this isn't just poison in the figurative sense, unhealthy foods and drinks like sugary sodas or the Twinkies you panic bought after believing they were going to be discontinued forever, only to have them gather dust at the back of your pantry. No, I'm talking real, poisonous, hazardous materials being ingested. Borax, arsenic, lead, and formaldehyde, to name a few. This wasn't just some instance of food manufacturers keeping a case of rat poison a little too close to the packaging station, though this also occurred. But it was often an intentional adding of chemicals into the nation's food supply to pad the company's bottom line. Until, that is, people had enough and decided to take a stand, and a group of 12 men volunteered to put their bodies up for testing the effects of these substances, forming what would become known as the Poison Squad. Welcome to the Biographical Babbler. As the decades progressed throughout the 1800s, the United States began rapidly industrializing, with people flocking into the cities for jobs and factories. Gone were the days of communities growing and producing their own foods. Instead, food centers needed to produce sustenance to be carted into cities to feed the masses. Yet, refrigeration was still decades off, leading to massive amounts of spoilage before the goods could reach the end consumer. There were a few ways to combat this. The first was something that had been used for thousands of years: salt, which dehydrated foods to prevent bacterial growth. But this was mainly used for meat and fish. Another way was canning, a practice going as far back as the beginning of the 19th century. It sealed off the food from outside elements, preserving it better than if it was transported in open air, but these weren't perfect, especially since some of the cans used early on were sealed with lead alloys. So the late 1800s were seeing more and more experimentation with food additives that could extend the life of food as it went from the farm to the processor to the dinner plate of a city-based factory worker. To illustrate this, let's hone in on a particular example. When you lived in a farming community, it wasn't uncommon to have a milkman go door to door with milk that was produced from the cow that day. Chances are, many people in these primarily agrarian communities often had their own dairy cow. But even if they didn't, the daily deliveries from the milkman got them the fresh milk that they could use. When that milk had to then make a days-long trip to a city, it clearly wouldn't last the entire way. But those transporting it found that if you added formaldehyde, the substance used for embalming dead people, the milk would stop or at least slow the decomposition process, just as it does with a deceased human body. It's hard to fathom exactly how people thought this was a good idea. It was dangerous enough on its own since as little as 1 ounce can kill an adult human, but the milk was made even worse with the stuff that was present that wasn't meant to preserve, only to deceive. You see, some dairy farmers wanted to get away with selling more while producing less, and would water down their milk. The worst part of this was that the water occasionally was just pulled from any random body of water, as demonstrated from a 1900 case where a family noticed that their milk was wriggling. This turned out to be worms, which had gotten into the milk when the dairy farmer watered it down with stagnant water from a nearby lake. This was rough, but it was only one example. I tell you this so that as we go forward, you'll keep in mind that these were the 2 reasons you'll see for these harmful substances making their way into the food supply. Either the supplier wanted to make the food last longer, or they were trying to scam their customer. Some felt that they had no choice but to put whatever they could afford to get their hands on into their bodies, whatever the impact may be. But others were more than aware of the damage being done. And soon, word would spread. When Upton Sinclair was just 28 years old, he published his fictional novel titled The Jungle as a way to bring more attention to the work and living conditions that immigrants who settled in America dealt with. The novel told a story of a Lithuanian immigrant family who endured many tragedies, one after another. Sinclair would describe the work environments the main character toiled away in extreme detail. Hot, cramped quarters filled with thousands of cattle, no concern given to cleaning or sanitizing the pens, nor the areas where the workers ate and even went to the bathroom. As for the quality of the meat itself, he described instances where the meat would fall onto the floor in dirt, sawdust, and the poison that was used to try and rid the facility of rats, and oftentimes these rats were thrown in with the tainted cattle meat as well. These horrifying descriptions within the fictional book were exceptionally descriptive, and while the story of the Lithuanian family was fictional, the descriptions of the meatpacking conditions were unfortunately very real. In writing The Jungle, Sinclair researched worker conditions by visiting several stockyards that processed animal meat, notably going to the Chicago Union Stockyard, which, just upstream from downtown Chicago, was a square mile of animal processing facilities, slaughtering 18 million animals in a single year at their peak. Once called the hog butcher for the world, this facility provided growth and many jobs to the immigrants who settled in the nearby Windy City. After spending 7 weeks touring places just like this one and interviewing the workers there, Sinclair began his work of fiction. Though The Jungle's purpose was to highlight the struggle of immigrants, with the Lithuanian family enduring tragedies from unemployment to imprisonment and alcoholism, those that read it became more caught up in the descriptions of the facilities themselves. Within the first year of its publication, The Jungle sold more than 150,000 copies. Sinclair, who wasn't as passionate about the meatpacking industry as he was about the immigrant struggles, was conflicted about his book's success, especially as the meatpacking plants began dragging his name through the mud in the newspapers. Sinclair, upset with the public response to his novel, would go on to say about his book, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." But while the 1906 publication of The Jungle certainly got the public riled up, this wasn't the first time people wanted change in the food industry. In the year 1820, Europe had their own version of The Jungle, a book called A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons, written by chemist Frederick Ecume. He describes similarly horrid food conditions within London, saying, "Our pickles are made green by copper, our vinegar rendered sharp by sulfuric acid, our comfits mixed of sugar, starch, and clay, with colored preparations of copper and lead." The mid-1800s saw many deaths due to these poisonings, including 21 people passing away after consuming candy laced with arsenic trioxide in Bradford, Yorkshire. The company that made the candy claimed they did it accidentally, but even after noticing the workers who handled the candy getting sick, he still put it up for sale. Given the death toll, the confectioner was arrested, but they quickly realized they had to let him go because, shockingly, there was no law against making and selling lethal food. Public outcry persisted over what became known as the Bradford Incident, leading to the 1860 passage of Britain's Act for Preventing Adulteration in Food and Drink, which said that businesses who were deemed to have been poisoning food would be hit with a £5 fine. Really. This wasn't a lot, but it was still better than America at the time. For decades before Sinclair wrote The Jungle, the United States Congress had tried several times to regulate the food industry, but nothing ever really seemed to stick, in part because the sums of money these industries were paying to politicians were outweighing any public outcry. But the outrage that The Jungle garnered pushed many to immediate action, most notable of which was President Theodore Roosevelt, who was livid upon reading what was happening to America's food supply, because he had had similar run-ins with the food himself. In 1895, war broke out. Cubans seeking independence from Spain's colonial oppression began to rebel, and the US was sympathetic. After an unexplained sinking of the American battleship the USS Maine, the United States launched into the Spanish-American War. An army of American military under General William Shafter landed on the coast just east of Santiago, Cuba, and began to advance on the city. Among these troops was none other than future President Theodore Roosevelt. Upon hearing of the war breaking out, he resigned from his post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy and volunteered to form a regiment to join the fight, creating the now famous regiment, Roosevelt's Rough Riders. But there was a slight hiccup. The Army ordered provisions for the men fighting from American meat packers. They brought in thousands of pounds of canned meat from the United States, And the soldiers, after long days of fighting and marching, began to dig in. Though one soldier, who worked as a funeral home director back in the US, said the meat smelled like an embalmed human body. And what was being used to embalm bodies? Yep, formaldehyde. Roosevelt claimed he initially chastised his men for throwing out the packaged food instead of eating it, saying that they didn't go to war to eat fancy menus. Then he took a look at the rations himself. The slimy, stringy meat, sometimes combined with what looked like charred bits of rope, horrified Roosevelt. He called the meat unedible, unpalatable, unwholesome, and utterly unsafe and unfit. And I'm sure if he thought of more words that started with un, he would have included those too. Those that ate the meat became sick, and those that didn't became starved. The US prevailed in the Spanish-American War after about 10 weeks of fighting, and although approximately 300 soldiers died in combat, it's estimated that perhaps double that amount succumbed to illnesses imparted from their rations. This tragedy that became known as the embalmed beef scandal was a big deal at the time. Most of what we know about it comes from Teddy Roosevelt testifying before Congress about the severity of the meat's quality. So when Teddy Roosevelt became President Roosevelt and received word that Americans were being poisoned in the same way those soldiers he brought to war had been, it hit close to home. He got in contact with Sinclair, but he knew that it wouldn't be an easy conversation. President Roosevelt was already well aware of who Upton Sinclair was. He'd already spoken out against the author, as Roosevelt opposed Sinclair's socialist ideology. This distrust of each other went both ways. Sinclair didn't trust Roosevelt, as seeing how his 1904 campaign for the presidency had been donated around $200,000 from the meatpacking industry. But setting aside their differences, Sinclair met with Roosevelt at the White House. And when they met, Sinclair mentioned that in his research, he found meatpackers who claimed to have paid off investigators from the Department of Agriculture in the past who came to check on their operations. Don't worry, we'll circle back around to the Department of Agriculture later. Roosevelt sent investigators separate from the Department of Agriculture to Chicago stockyards. As they left, Sinclair voiced that he was nervous about the meatpackers, saying that they might have tried to clean up the place since the release of his novel, misrepresenting what the investigators might find once they arrived. This would not be a problem at all. Even with the public outcry, it didn't seem like the meatpackers had made any effort to change their operations. The Neil Reynolds report that the president would read from the investigators would show that the conditions were as bad or worse than their depictions in Sinclair's novel. Roosevelt used this report, as well as the outcry from the public, to get Congress to legislate both the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which he promptly signed into law. And this is where the story typically ends. Roosevelt and Sinclair went back to being at odds with one another, and the country was made just a little bit safer. But this story leaves out a pivotal character, someone working largely in the background, but once he stepped into the light, it would ignite the flames of public discontent that would spur action within the politicians of the United States. This man was Dr. Harvey Wiley, and he would be the one to form the Poison Squad. Harvey Washington Wiley was born in a log cabin on April 16, 1844. His father, Preston Wiley, was a farmer who also preached in southern Indiana and was a fierce abolitionist. In the fields of their land, young Harvey would learn about growing food, milking cattle, and even how to process food into an early form of syrup made from sorghum cane. Harvey got a good idea of what pure food looked like from an early age. But his early education wouldn't stop there. Preston would read to his 7 children at night, typically choosing books about the horrors of slavery. Preston was so opposed to the practice that he opened up his farm to any slaves that escaped the South, typically Kentucky, becoming the southernmost underground railroad stop in Indiana. It's fair to say that this made a pretty substantial impact on Harvey because when he was in college and the Civil War broke out, he wasted no time in joining, becoming part of the 137th Indiana Infantry. While he was deployed to Tennessee and Alabama, Wiley would continue his education, spending his off hours studying anatomy and repeating what he learned to fellow soldiers while they were on guard duty watching over the railroad lines. His time fighting for the Union would be cut short, however, after a wave of measles hit his unit very hard. He was discharged and sent back home, going back to college to earn his bachelor's and then his master's degree in 1867. Wiley firmly believed that it was his calling in life to become a doctor, saying that physicians cannot climb to heaven and pull down immortality, but might assist patients in living lives full of health and happiness and hope. This was great and respectable, but after he earned his MD, he would find that he didn't actually like the process of caring for the sick directly. After a few years of going from high school to high school teaching chemistry throughout Indiana, Dr. Wiley would serve as state chemist for Indiana while working out of Purdue University, and this was where he would find his life's calling. While working there, he began analyzing different sugars and syrups being sold in the state. A lot of products he found claiming to be maple syrup or honey were essentially watered down corn syrup, and some of them were nothing but corn syrup. In total, he found that around 90% of his tested samples were fakes, saying of the honey that there were beekeepers who had not of late been bothering to keep bees.
Boom. Roasted.
He aggressively began pursuing these bad faith businessmen, getting the word out to the public, but before long, he was being actively recruited by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to replace its chief chemist and take his fight to the national level. He agreed in 1883 and moved to Washington, D.C. Wiley may have felt that taking over as chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture would be the best place to get the word out about the toxic food entering public consumption, but it wouldn't be so cut and dry. Now running experiments for the federal government, Wiley began immediately tackling issues with the food supply, publishing a report in 1887 about milk containing descriptions of a product that had been thinned out, watered down, dirtied, and then whitened with chalk. It contained bacteria, and even though this took place a good 35 years after the report that was mentioned at the beginning of the video, he found one sample of milk that had a worm wriggling in the bottom. Yet this, in addition to a similarly horrid report of the state of butter and margarine in the United States, wasn't enough for the Department of Agriculture to give any widespread condemnation. After putting out a study that said the nation's lard products were devoid of actual lard, he found that few people really read or even understood his reports. This lack of reach extended into Congress as well, as the majority of the legislation Wiley supported failed. But he did have someone who understood where he was coming from. In 1888, a congressman by the name of William H.F. Lee met with Wiley, saying that the work of the food fraud studies that he was conducting was as nearly nonpartisan in its work as an institution can be under our system. And then later, predicting that either Congress got their act together now, or they would be forced to later, saying angry waves of popular discontent would eventually bring change. Wiley just needed to get the public to understand the effects of the poison they were putting in their bodies. The next few years saw Wiley get repeated roadblocks thrown up from accomplishing just that, having his budget cut from $15,000 to just $5,000, and a threat from the new Secretary of Agriculture to remove his studies entirely. Secretary Morton didn't really care about false food or even dangerous food entering the food supply, focusing on instead aiding farmers growing their food, saying that sending investigators out to gather data on the quality of food was a waste of taxpayer money. This note came just after Wiley put out research that showed coffee that was being sold within the United States had been mixed with stuff as mild as tree bark, sawdust, and ground up acorns, and with ingredients far more dangerous like powdered iron, arsenic, cyanide, and lead, writing that 87% of all ground coffee samples tested were adulterated, with one containing no traces of coffee at all. This was the stuff that the new Secretary of Agriculture was saying wasn't important enough to keep looking into. In one letter to Wiley, Secretary Morton told him that the more people were informed about the adulteration, the more they would demand untainted food. Yeah, that's the whole point. When Wiley was looking into the use of preservatives in wine in 1894, he overran costs by $100. $100 that Secretary Morton forced him to pay out of his own pocket. It was looking like the end was near if Wiley wasn't able to find some traction soon. Traction that would come in the form of the embalmed beef scandal. You see, while Roosevelt was testifying before Congress, Wiley had help passed down from the president to look into America's canned beef supplies. Wiley found that the meat was bad, just as bad as Sinclair would write about in the future, but when he went on to testify before Congress, his case began to fall apart. He said that the preservatives in the Army supplies included boric acid, salicylic acid, sulfites, and sulfuric acid, but when pressed, admitted that there wasn't enough data to determine how dangerous these things were when ingested. Most damaging to his case was the fact that he couldn't find traces of formaldehyde at the meatpacking company, something many of the soldiers who ate the meat insisted was present. The panel concluded that the deaths were likely not caused by the meat at all, rather tropical illness in the soldiers drinking dirty water. The meat packers got off the hook once again, but unbeknownst to Wiley, he was about to receive inspiration for an experiment that would reshape public opinion on their food. In 1901, a South Dakotan food chemist named James Shepard was launching a public campaign to advocate for food safety. To demonstrate the harm to the public, he publicized his menu illustrating the chemicals pervasive in an average family dinner. As scary as the name sounded to people who read the menu, that was really all it had going for it. Shepard, and well, Wiley for that matter too, could really only speculate as to what the exact harm of these were to humans. It's not like they had isolated a person's diet and given them a particular chemical to see what would happen. The closest they had come to this before was for food manufacturers to give the food to rabbits, occasionally in the form of an injection. If the rabbits weren't dead within minutes, then the additives were considered safe for human consumption. Not exactly scientific. And Wiley himself knew with the variety and amounts of the chemicals the average American was consuming, it was next to impossible to determine from observing them what actually was causing the harm. He decided that the only way to determine the true harm to the human body was to bring Shepard's sensationalized menu to life, willfully giving people the chemicals he believed could be fatal. The basement of the Department of Agriculture's headquarters in DC gave the appearance of an exclusive restaurant, set apart from public view in a similar fashion to the speakeasies that would come about decades later. A sign at the entrance of the room read, "Only the brave dare to eat the fare." 2 oak tables covered in white tablecloths saw 6 chairs at each. Plain white china were laid out with care. Meals were served on an exact schedule. 8 a.m. breakfast, noon lunch, 5:30 p.m. dinner, every single day. The adjoining kitchen was kept immaculately clean for the time, with all the essential equipment for a high-end dining experience. It had the highest quality, freshest ingredients Wiley could get his hands on, with no traces of preservatives of any kind. There was roast beef, steak, veal, pork, chicken, turkey, fish, and every fruit and vegetable you could get your hands on at the turn of the century. The milk was pasteurized with no chemical preservatives. Everything was procured with the utmost care, including the people that were to dine there. After posting an advertisement that was circulated to government employees offering 3 square meals a day, free of charge to anyone willing to participate in the study, Dr. Wiley waited hesitantly for any responses. And surprisingly, there were many. Hundreds of young men, barely making enough to get by, were applying, many seeing this as a way to stretch their budget by alleviating the cost of food. But soon, word of the experiment leaked out of the confines of government employees, and Wiley would see far more applications than anticipated. People began writing in from all over the nation, one saying, "I read of your experiments on diet. I have a stomach that can stand anything. I have a stomach that will surprise you. What do you think of it?" A bit too eager in my opinion, but Wiley wasn't just looking for people willing to eat. He wanted people who had passed the civil service exam, essentially an IQ test for government employees at the time, making sure they were qualified for the job they were trying to get. He wanted those who had high moral character and reputations for sobriety and reliability. Also, very importantly for some reason, they couldn't be female. Wiley had an odd stance on women, at one point saying to chemists visiting from Europe that man's highest ambition in this country is to strive to be the equal of women, and other times giving misogynistic statements against women, saying that they weren't by nature to follow the pursuits which are reserved for men. But soon they had tables filled with men who had upstanding reputations, ready for the vigorous testing of what Dr. Wiley called the hygienic table trials. Not quite as catchy. But the participants were closely observed, getting weighed before each meal along with having their temperature and pulse taken. They also had samples of their stool, urine, hair, and sweat taken during their weekly physicals. The two tables the men sat at during the study would switch between receiving untainted food for 2 weeks and then receiving food dosed with a particular preservative. Then they would compare the effects. During this time, the subjects could only eat or drink what was being served in the test kitchen, and abstaining from anything else, which is probably why Wiley wanted people known for their reliability. After discovering the first chemical preservative tested, borax, did things like cause headaches and stomach aches, newspapers began reporting on the study. And although he wanted to get the word out about the harm the chemicals they were testing caused, Wiley didn't want the press reporting on incomplete results from an unfinished study, telling the participants that if they weren't quiet about the experiment, they would be immediately dismissed. Yet word still got out, with one journalist at a Washington newspaper calling the group of participants the Poison Squad, and the name stuck. Over the following weeks, the Poison Squad tested sulfuric acid, saltpeter, formaldehyde, and copper sulfate. Nearly all of the tests had severe symptoms show up in the participants, but some were particularly brutal. Wiley had to stop the sodium sulfide test halfway through because of the pain the subjects were in, and only 3 of the 12 volunteers would make it to the end of the sodium benzoate test. As the word began to spread and Wiley saw the impact it was making on public perception, he decided to lean into it, using the name the Poison Squad in speeches and reaching out to women's rights advocates to spread the word about the harm these companies were bringing to their families, notably bringing the Women's Christian Temperance Union reports of their findings. This was the group that made the push for causes like women's suffrage and the prohibition, and it would prove a huge ally to Wiley's cause, with one Chicago editor following the movement writing, "Now let the food adulterer quail, for we have women on our side." This was the buildup in the United States when Upton Sinclair released The Jungle. The public had been inundated with reports about these scientific trials in Washington and were aware that these substances were in their food. But The Jungle, showing just how little they cared about putting in any effort to ensure safe food, spurred the public to act. When Congress brought up the idea of the Pure Food and Drug Act, Harvey Washington, along with one of the most prominent feminist activists at the time, Alice Lakely, met with President Roosevelt in 1905. He asked them to shore up any letters to Congress that they could to help push the votes over the edge. And while Wiley was doing his part in getting the reports of the Poison Squad trials out, it's estimated that Lakely's direction was able to get over 1 million women to write letters in support of the act. In a time where the United States population was around 84 million people, this spoke volumes, and ultimately spurred Congress to action, passing the Pure Food and Drug Act, which President Roosevelt signed into law on June 30th, 1906. The biggest hurdle of this battle was won, but it wasn't the end. Although the bill said that the labels needed to be accurate, all the chemicals being used as preservatives weren't banned in the act. Instead, a new segment of government was given more authority, the Bureau of Chemistry. It was made to serve as a regulatory body over food and drugs in the United States, testing them to determine if they were safe for the general population. There seemed no better person to lead this division than the man now being called the father of the Pure Food and Drug Act, Harvey Wiley. He was finally given a proper budget and hundreds of employees and went to work, building out the division that would change its name in 1927 to the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. Wiley wouldn't stay there forever, leaving his role in 1912, but his impact remained. A Liberty ship in World War II was named the SS Harvey W. Wiley in his honor. He had his own stamp issued by the post office 50 years after the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. Numerous buildings have been named after him, and a gravestone within Arlington National Cemetery that says, "The father of the Pure Food Law." But presumably the thing he would be most proud of is the remarkable improvement in the quality of food we consume today. No, it's not. But I'm not going to get political with this section, just update you on where we stand today, and you can do with that information what you will. While Wiley made significant progress in his time, it wasn't without detractors. These would culminate in 1958 when the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act would have an amendment added that changed the way additives were handled. Basically, the FDA has to approve things we consume before they go to market unless they fall under GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. This essentially means that companies can circumvent the FDA testing requirements if there's nothing that says the additive is dangerous to humans as recognized by experts with qualified scientific training to evaluate its safety. This doesn't specify the process by which this is determined or whose payroll these experts must be on. This was partly done to protect businesses' secret ingredients, leading to labels that say things like spices or artificial flavor or fragrances. But it can be dangerous to allow chemicals untested by a regulatory agency to slip into the public's use, which was seen almost immediately after the amendment was passed when cranberry containers being sold were found to have substantial amounts of cancer-causing pesticide in them. Oh yeah, and this was found out the week of Thanksgiving, like the only time of year people have cranberries. Clearly, we still have more that can be done, but it's fair to say that instead of looking at the ways Wiley's work has been undone, we can see just how far we've come, the impact that can be made through public awareness, and that we can be the change we want to see in the world, even if we have to overcome barriers every step of the way. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been the Biographical Babbler. I just wanted to give another shout out to The Poison Squad, a book written by Deborah Blum, which served as the primary source of information for many of the parts of the video concerning Harvey Wiley and the Poison Squad. I highly recommend giving it a read if any of this was of interest to you. There is a lot more to the story, and also a lot of descriptions of food that I didn't cover for time or to save those with sensitive stomachs. I'm also linking the FDA's page on GRAS with my sources if you would like to read more about them. Also, like I mentioned in my first video, I made this channel to cover various historical figures, places, and events. So if you would like to leave suggestions for me to look into, feel free and I'll check them out. Anyway, I guess feel free to do all the YouTube stuff like liking, sharing, and commenting to help boost the video, but in the end, I hope you liked it. Be safe, have fun, and I'll see you in the next one. Good talk.